Next up, we need lighting. So we have two of these lights here. I can demonstrate first how lighting in real works. It's not ideal, it's quite complicated actually. It's much more complicated than it looks. There's a lot of thinking and preparation going into it. Let me actually get my sphere back that I used before. It's quite a good example. And let me place something in front of the sphere, something to cast a shadow. Let's just take a cone or something, doesn't really matter what. So the shadow covers half of the sphere. There's a light here. And then actually before we do anything, we should have a light mass importance volume present. This is similar to Unreal Engine 3, but you should define what area of the level needs higher detail lighting. So before I'm going to demonstrate any lighting, I first want to make sure the engine understands that this area we're working in here should be treated as high quality. So let's do that step first. On the left side, go to volumes and find light mass importance volume. Drag the light mass importance volume into the level to get this small little frame here. In the properties of that frame, you can see in brush settings XYZ, make it quite a bit larger, make sure it covers the entire level. So still not big enough. It should cover everything where the player can go. It shouldn't cover distant geometry, but all the areas where the player can get near to. So something like this seems to work fine. Small area on the left, actually it should be longer still, so wrong direction. I have 16,000, 24,000 and 8,000 high, something like that. And you can see it covers the entire corridor inside. It covers this part, it covers everywhere where it can go. It doesn't cover the rocks here, but that doesn't matter. Again, it only should cover the area where you need high detail lighting, so only the places where you can actually get to as a player. That's it, the moment the volume is present, you're done. So let's go back to lighting here. In the properties, first of all, you got normal things. You got intensity, clearly that's how bright it is. As mentioned, there is this use inverse square fall off. I usually turn it off, then it's more similar to Unreal Engine 1, 2 and 3. It's a simpler lighting setup. I find it much easier to control, so I turn that off. There's obviously the light color. It's quite straightforward as well. There's the radius, that's just how far the light will reach. Then we have source radius and source length, and these basically replace the specular power from Unreal Engine 3. So you can see here now, there's this small little highlight on my sphere. That's the light reflecting in it, so that's the specular highlight of the light I've placed. If I move the light, the spot moves. The source radius and source length allows me to increase that. So if I make this source radius 64, you can see the dot increases. I make it 512, I get a much bigger dot, but it also starts to lose power. So again, this is exactly what specular power is in Unreal Engine 3. By default, it's very small, it's 0. And if you leave it at 0, you might get very strong and very harsh reflections. I can try moving it here, I'm not sure if it's going to show up, but let me try the metal I've made here. It might need more contrast or more brightness, let's see what we can get going. But metal here is obviously a bit reflective. At some point you might get very harsh, it's hard to see here, this is not the ideal example, but you might get very harsh reflections. And then increasing the source radius could soften them out a bit. You can see now it becomes wider but less powerful. So you probably want to set this on a per light basis. Similarly, you also have source length, and this allows you to make rectangular lights, specular wise at least, not where it casts light from, but at least for the specular. See, let's try to make it smaller. You can see now it reflects this instead. So you will want to modify these to depend on the shape of your lights. Let me just go back to default here, so it's easier. There's also an indirect lighting intensity. This is how much light will bounce away from it. So how much of this light will hit this and then it will bounce away from the object. How much of its original energy does it retain when it bounces away? Then you can obviously turn off affect worlds. If you do that, it basically is off. Also, to turn a light off, you can set visible to false, which does the same thing. Cast shadow is obvious, whether it casts shadow or not. And then there's a number of more advanced options. I'm not going to go over these in detail here, given this is introduction tutorial, but you have light fall of exponent. This is how quickly the light disappears. So you can see the light now starts to fade somewhere around here. If I decrease this, the light will go further, or in other words, it loses energy less fast. And it has a harsher contrast. The light doesn't drop off as fast. If I increase it higher, then the light will be more subtle. The radius is still the same, but the light has lost so much energy by the time it's here, you really can't see it anymore. So the default is 8, I think. I'll put it at 4. You can minimum roughness. It has an impact on the physical based rendering. I'm not gonna skip that for now. Self-shadowing accuracy the same, shadow bias the same, etc. You can make sure it doesn't affect translucent lighting, which might be nice here and there. I'm actually using that in Solus here and there to make sure the lights don't light up some of the particles. There's that. So we have lights like that, but there's one very important setting at the top, and that's called mobility, and it's set to stationary right now by default. You've got 3 levels: static, stationary, and movable. In order to do lighting on Engine 4 correctly, it's absolutely vital that you use these correctly. And they all have very specific advantages and disadvantages. So I'm going to show you this now. Basically, static is what a static light was in Unreal Engine 3, minus some of the advantages the lights had on Unreal Engine 3. Stationary is basically what a dominant light was in Unreal Engine 3. And movable is what a movable light was in Unreal Engine 3. However, it's really not that simple. I can show you. First of all, let's set it to static. This is the cheapest type of light. This doesn't cost any performance. It will just bake into the light maps, and that's it. Similar to Unreal Engine 3. So in other words, I could have 50 million of these and it would still render just fine. It wouldn't do anything to performance. It would keep rendering just fine. So they're very, very cheap. But unlike Unreal Engine 3, they can't handle specular highlights. So what happened in Unreal Engine 3 was when you placed a static light, is it would actually bake the specular highlights into a light map. So it pretty much baked the specular highlight angles and positions. It doesn't do that here anymore. Therefore, if I now rebuild this, I will lose any form of specular highlight. And you can see after rebuild, it has lost the specular highlight. There's reflections, because we've placed the reflection capture actors, but there's no actual specular reflection from the light. So that's a very clear limitation of static light. Also, if you have dynamic meshes, I don't have any dynamic meshes in the scene here, but I mean the player, enemies, doors, vehicles, anything that moves, anything that's a dynamic mesh, that won't be lit up by static lights, or if it does, it will be lit up very inaccurately or not very good at all. So in other words, static lights are very fast to render, they're the most efficient performance-wise, but they will not give any specular highlights on materials, and they will not work well with dynamic meshes. So that's a very strong limitation. So you can't rely on just static lights like you did in Unreal Engine 3. In Unreal Engine 3 you could have built an entire environment using just static lights and it would have looked just fine. You can no longer do that. Also, this will only render shadows that are baked. So you can see here on the ground, the shadow is quite jaggy, it's low resolution. It's also low resolution, of course, because the light map that was applied to the mesh is low resolution, but it doesn't do anything to improve that quality. There is no dynamic shadow, there's absolutely nothing. It's a very straightforward light. Secondly, we got stationary lights. These are basically a blend between a movable light and a static light, so it's a bit in both. In fact, let's actually do the movable light first, so I can more properly explain why a stationary light is in between both of them. So a movable light is a fully dynamic light. It has no light maps whatsoever. You can see the light map is still present here because I haven't rebuilt the level again. But if I were to rebuild the level again now, the light map from the previous light would be removed and we would only have the sharp shadow from the dynamic light. So it's a fully dynamic light similar to Unreal Engine 3. It does not get baked into the geometry. You can move it, you can do with it what you want. It will have a specular highlight on there as well. Might be hard to see with the reflections actually on the mesh. See there's a small dot there. So it's fully dynamic. There's not much to say there. This is the worst for performance usually, because again it is a fully dynamic light with fully dynamic shadows, but it also usually looks the best. But it has this one limitation, is that it doesn't support any indirect lighting. There is no real-time global illumination, So as you can see here, the shadows here are pitch black. There is no bounce lighting. It's very straightforward. Light begins here, goes there. If it's hitting somewhere in between, the light will stop, and that's it. So this might give the scene a bit of a simplistic look. Then we have stationary, which is the blend between both. In theory, stationary lights are ideal, but there is one huge drawback, which I'll get back to later on. Let me first explain what a stationary light is. It basically uses distant field shadows. I'm going to have to rebuild for this again, but let me place it about where the other one was. I think that was about this angle. So you can see this is the jaggy light map we got with a static light. Now we have a stationary light in the same position. Let's rebuild again. The shadow is actually sharp as well. So what this does, and again, a dominant directional light or any dominant light in Unleashed 3 did exactly the same thing, is it takes both static functionality and fully dynamic functionality and it blends them both together. So it will cast both a light map and a dynamic shadow at the same time. In fact, it will take the light map it cast and then it will draw over that again, to say it in simple terms, with a dynamic shadow, therefore improving the quality of the light map. So the light map becomes the base for the dynamic shadow rendered on top. Therefore, you get much sharper shadows, but it still makes the light map as well. It does both. This also means that I can actually, because it's part dynamic, I can't move it. So you can never move this type of light in a game, but you can actually change the color and the intensity. So if I now change the intensity, I don't have to rebuild. So no text appear saying I should rebuild the level. So in fact, you can actually change the brightness and the color of these kind of stationary lights in the game. If I want the light to be flickering, it's a horror game, I could do this. You know, I can animate the value there through Blueprint and I can make the light flickering. So again, it's really a blend between both of them. Because it's a blend between both of them, because it has light maps as well, it also supports indirect lighting. It's hard to see here probably on this scene. I mean, it's not ideally set up. But it does actually, you can see a little bit here, there's a bit of brightness behind it. Actually, you can rather switch to lighting only, hard to see as well. But it does do indirect lighting as well. So you can freely change the color without having to rebuild. You can freely change the brightness, it does indirect lighting, it gives much sharper shadows than static ones. It also has specular highlights still. Again, it's part dynamic as well, so the dynamic part of the light ensures you retain your specular highlights on meshes. So it does all of that really well. So you would say this is the perfect light to use, right? And it would have been if it wouldn't have been for this problem. If I start duplicating this around, you have the same issue as dominant directional lights or dominant lights in Unleashed 3. In Unleashed 3, you could only have one dominant light in a level at any given time. Well, here you can have more of them. I can have 4 of them. But I can't have more than 4 of them. You can see now I duplicated it to number 5. The moment I have more than 4 of them overlapping, and to be clear, it's when they overlap. If I were to spread these 5 lights out over a very large area, it would have been just fine. So it's only about the fact that they overlap. But when they overlap, you can see one of them starts getting a cross through them. If I duplicate it again, so I have 6 of them, then I get a second cross. The thing is, you can only have 4 of these overlapping at any given time. And that's quite very limiting. So imagine, for example, that you're trying to build several floors of a building above each other. Let me just very quickly build that, and you can see immediately how this is going to go very wrong very fast. So let's simulate that we have a building here. So this is the floor of a building. So it's one floor, and then there's a floor above it, and there's a floor above that. And there's a floor above that. Let's say you have an apartment building or an office building or something, and it's 4 floors, and the player can get on all 4 floors. So let's give another one above that. Then what you would do, I guess, is the following. You would have a light on one floor, then you would have a light on the second floor, or you'll probably have 2 lights on each floor actually. You probably have multiple lamps in the same office floor. And you can see where this is gonna go. This still has a cross through it. It's never gonna work because it's about overlapping lights. Now the radius of these, the radii, are quite large, but even if I were to decrease it, I can never prevent these lights from overlapping. So if I make, even if I make it smaller, let's do this, you still end up with situations where this one overlaps with all of these below. So building these kind of things in Unreal Engine 4 at this very point is pretty much impossible unless you want to sacrifice lighting quality. So again, it looks simple, but it's actually quite advanced to use this properly. It's very limiting, and you really have to be aware of what you're doing if you want to use this properly. And it should be noted, however, that the number of light, if you place more of these than you can, so if you place 5 of them, they will still work. So they will all still work, except that this one will begin rendering its shadows in fully dynamic mode. So this one will still cast shadows, but they will be much more performance heavy than these. So it will still work, but your performance will just begin to degrade quite fast. If you want to work around that, you can always turn off shadows. The moment you turn off shadows, the cross disappears as well. So it's not about the actual light, it's rather about the shadow casting. That's what causes the problems. So if you turn off cast shadows, you can have as many of these as you want, pretty much. But that's obviously not very ideal either. Okay, so how do we light out a level as we have it over here? Well, you will want to have a blend between static lights and stationary lights. You want to have static lights far away from places where the player can't go. You want to have static lights for indirect lighting, for weak lights, for anything that's not very obvious. And you want to use stationary lights for very obvious bright lights. So let's start with those bright lights actually. I usually begin placing it around at all the bright lights, and then I evaluate later on if there's any one of them that overlap and have reached the limit. So there's a light here. I placed a little lamp there. Let's make this, I don't know, 12 or something, and make the color a bit orangish. So therefore you actually want to make sure the radius is as small as possible, and because the radius should be as small as possible, it is therefore probably a good idea to increase the light fall of exponents, or decrease rather, sorry. Because again, if it's very high, you can only see the light until here. None of this really is visible anymore. Therefore, you need an even bigger radius just to make sure the light shows up. Therefore, I tend to decrease this to even 2 perhaps, allowing me to shrink the radius. Something like so. If you want to have the exact values, you can always look in my example level to see what the values I had there were, the brightness and the color values. Now here in the corridor, it's a bit of a more difficult situation because the light is here. But if I place my stationary light near the ceiling, then, well, obviously it doesn't even get to the floor. It's just a sphere. So there's a number of things we can do here. First of all, this is not really good. You don't want to use your very precious stationary lights for something that's far away from the player. The player is at the ground level. You don't want to be spending your best lights at the ceiling, right? So for that reason alone already, this doesn't work. But instead of using a point light, we can also use a different type of light called a spotlight. So on the left side, in lights, you have a section called spotlight. Light, spotlight, drag that one in instead. That one works exactly the same, except for the fact that it's a spotlight, so it points down. It only points in one direction. I'm going to copy the color from this one. So if you click on the color, you can actually drag the color from here to the bar at the top. The bar at the top is probably empty for you. I already had a color in there. In fact, let me just get a new one. Probably looks like this for you. You can just drag it in here, and by dragging it in there, it will remember it, and you can basically copy the light over to the other one. Let me delete that. Again, same system here, static, stationary, movable. I'm going to leave it at stationary and see how far I get with that. It also has inverse squared fall off going, so I'll turn that off. And let's see if we can get going. I'll increase it. I want to have the radius big enough so it reaches for the floor. And I'll decrease the fall of exponent there as well, so now it gets to the ground. It's rather bright though. Oh, intensity is still very high. So that works. So now we have nice sharp shadows on the ground. The angle is a bit wide. You can see the angle goes all the way over here, but we have more lights in between, so I don't want the angle to go that far. So outer cone angle, say 16 perhaps, or 20. 20 seems to work. In fact, let me delete this one and that one. So we only have a lamp at every second set of pillars. Makes it a bit easier to light things out with. So this appears to work. It's pitch black here, but if I were to rebuild the level, the lightning would bounce from here back up the wall and this would get eliminated some. However, that might not be enough. So what I'm gonna do is also place some bounce lights manually nearby. So the lighting approach I'm taking is actually quite old school. It's similar to what you did all the way in Unreal Engine 1. I'm still very much so sticking to that. I think it works just fine, especially for a non-realistic game as this. So I copied the other light, one of the point lights, and I'm going to use this to illuminate the areas near the lights and illuminate the areas in between, etc. Basically manually place fill lights. Because I'm going to have quite a lot of those, I'm going to set that to static. Because again, this is going to be a weak light. In fact, it's going to be quite weak. So let's say brightness 4, intensity 4. And because it's a weak light, it should be static. And then I'm going to copy actually a couple of them. So it's more of a series down. So there's one light at the top near the light source, and there's a second one about where the radius of this one seems to stop. And then I do the same thing moving down. So I manually make a row of lights basically moving down to soften it out a bit so you don't have these pitch black shadows. Seems to work. Once I've set up a couple of lights, basically one light for every type of lamp, I tend to rebuild for a moment just to see how it shows up after a rebuild. Okay, so after a rebuild shows up like this. It's a little bit yellow, it's a bit bright as well. That said, it is difficult to do the lighting without the post-processing there. So we haven't done any color correction yet or anything like that. So the lighting will definitely change later on once we add in the correct post-processing. So there's one thing I'm gonna do here in order to tweak this easily later on. So we likely have to tweak this later. What we can do is we can name them. For example, these two lights here are identical and they belong to the small light, the small lamps on the wall. You can actually name things here and then they will show up in the scene outliner, because right now they're called point light 6 and 7. So I can call it, for example, small light for wall or whatever. You can see both of them can share the same name. That's totally fine. It's really just a label. It's just a name. So you can do with it whatever you want. And I will do the same here. Select everything that's similar. So these 4 lights are all the same. You can see all the properties are identical as well. So we'll call these indirect lights for hallway or something. Whatever really, as long as you can identify it. Actually, this light was the same, so you should probably copy the name of that as well. Or yeah, I have that actually. Good. And then the spotlight, I will call that hallway spotlight. And then this way, what you can do is every time you want to modify one type of light in your scene, you can simply search by that name. So if I'm going to copy this set over to over here, let's actually copy it a third time because we also need it for this lamp over here. And then I would figure out, oh, actually the color of my lights is wrong, it's too yellow or something, or I'd like to tweak it. Then I can simply use a scene outliner and I can select everything that's called hallway. In fact, you can probably just look for it, indirect light, and you just select all of those. Now you instantly have all those types of lights selected. And then you can tweak all of those and, for example, say, okay, but the indirect lighting intensity shouldn't be 1 but should be 0.25, for example. So it's easy to tweak everything later on, and that's how I organize my lights in Unreal Engine 4. I name them and then I can easily reference them later on. If you're doing a very large game and you want to make sure that everything remains the same type of lights, the same colors, the same brightnesses, etc., you might want to consider actually making a blueprint out of a light. So making a series of blueprints holding lights. Therefore you would be placing the blueprint in the level to light it out, and if ever you want to change the color, you would only have to change that color in the blueprint of for the light you're using, and it would update automatically in all the other levels. So that's how I would approach a very big game where majority of lamps and lights are always the same. Anyhow, the naming system works fine for a single level, so I'm going to stick to this. I'm going to leave it be for what it is right now. I might want to tweak it later on when I've done the post-processing. But for now it works. It's not very pretty, but it works. What I also tend to do is I tend to place some ambient lights around myself. So manually place lights. Again, it's kind of an old school approach, but I'm going to add in another point light here on the ground. I'm going to set it to static only because it's just an ambient light. Again, inverse squared fall off. I'm going to make it a little bit bluish and quite dark. Something like 1 actually. Maybe even less. It's hard to see on the video probably. But something like this, and then I tend to place these around as well, just to have a bit of blue ambient going on in the shadows. And we should probably name them actually. I'm going to increase the radius as well to 3000 say. Raise them up a bit. Something like that. Lastly, we have some lights outside, plus the lava actually. So let me take this one. Or actually, let me take the spotlight. It's gonna work even better, plus the light underneath. So this is also how I organize my scenes lighting wise. I tend to copy paste a lot. I tend to make just a few lamps, see how they work out, and once I found the right values, I tend to simply copy paste it around with the same, almost the same values, just to make sure it goes very fast. Okay, so that works. I'm gonna rename this then to whatever, spotlight for that. I think it should be rather larger here. Something like so. Again, it's hard to do this proper without post-processing and without indirect lighting build and without the skylight sets, which is the next step we'll do after we're done here. So most of this is likely in need of some tweaking later, but at least all the lights are now present and there is no overlapping issues with stationary lights overlapping. Everything seems to work. Then the lava, same thing there. Let's just add a new light. I'm gonna do all the lava just static because I'm gonna place a lot of these lights around, so it's not ideal. Again, there's no specular highlight then, but there's no other way really. So lava is fire, fire glows, so I want to make sure there are enough lights near the lava so it looks like it glows. I mean, you don't want to have a bright lava plane cutting into a black wall. You want to have it blend with the light. These are kind of small, so I'm going to set sprite scale to something bigger so it's easier to see. And then I basically just copy paste lights around to make sure everything near the lava is illuminated. And then I'm also going to place one bigger light in the middle of each pool just for general ambience. And then we have most of the normal lights placed. Then we need to set up the sky. So the sky is included in the example project, so I'm going to use that later on, but I'm first going to set up the sky from scratch just to explain how you would set up the sky if it weren't for my ready-made sky that's already in the project. First of all, what we need, and we need this anyway, with or without my sky, is in the world settings at the top toolbar. You need to look for light mass. Note, by the way, that the game type has been set here. If you're building a new level, you might want to set that as well. Solus game info is set as a game mode. Without that, the game wouldn't play correctly. Either way, in the light mass section, we have environment color and environment intensity. If you were to set something to environment color that is not black, then the sky itself, even if there is no sky, sky meaning basically the top of the world, so everything that's the top of the world would cast a light by itself coming down. So the world itself would cast a light. And we're going to use that for a general ambient light. So I'm going to set the color to that, to some kind of bluish. You can see it's still black here though, so make sure you use that slider as well. Something like that. Actually, it's still transparent here because the alpha is 0, so let's do alpha 255. Environment intensity works best if it's a little bit higher, so something like 3 or something. We can tweak it later. And that will do. So again, if you now rebuild, it will cast a blue light coming from the sky. That means that inside the building there wouldn't be any blue light. That's why I placed these myself. But outdoors, it would be lit up by a blue light. And the way I'm setting it up in Solus is that I'm using this for general ambience in the level, for indirect lighting basically, because that light would bounce around. And the sun is dynamic light that doesn't bounce around on top of this blue baseline. This is basically the foundation, and then the sun adds light on top of that. So okay, let's rebuild this.